Miigwech, Stan. First of all, I wanted to make sure that everyone can hear me. So give me a nod if the audio is good. Okay, fantastic. All right. First of all, I want to acknowledge the prayer of the elder this morning who shared so many good words about, being thankful and being in that state of grace and appreciating all that's around us. And I also wanted to recognize that keynote speaker, Cynthia, just amazing and really, really grounding us in a holistic lens and view on the issue of diabetes in our community. I really appreciated that. And a lot of the things she spoke about resonated with me personally. Ani, Eleanor, it's good to see people from my home territory on this session. I see there's lots and lots of people, so welcome to everyone. As Stan mentioned, I had the privilege last year and the previous year throughout COVID to work with IDHC on their strategic plan. And part of the strategic plan identified the need to do some information gathering. And so I was given the task of doing an environmental scan. And really what it entailed was three important parts. I'd say four, in fact. We did a little literature review and desk review of very promising initiatives, some of the ideas that are emerging in the current literature around diabetes care with a holistic lens. And a secondary part was a survey. And so many of you probably received a survey by SurveyMonkey, a link with many, many questions about the work of IDHC and how that can be improved and what more is needed. So there's a survey. And then there were also partner interviews where I invited people either to an online focus group or I spoke to many of you by phone. So I appreciate everyone that took the time to participate in those information gathering activities. And then the fourth compelling part of the environmental scan was having a discussion with IDHC's board about what these findings were saying to them and what more was needed and how to refine and tweak even the strategic plan that we had developed together. So those are the four pieces of the environmental scan. And with the time that I have, I'm going to try and touch on a few highlights from each of those areas, if possible. So the first thing I want to share is a little bit of the selected highlights from the desk review. So let me see if I can share this and walk you through a few highlights. And I was really so happy to hear Cynthia speaking about many of these ideas already in her presentation, because it really, you'll see that many of the themes that are described in this environmental scan link directly back to what Cynthia had talked about in her earlier remarks. So the first thing is remembering that, and I happen to do a lot of work in public health as well. And for a long time, I think there were not too good messaging about, modifying your risk factors and, making personal lifestyle choices. And it had really sort of engendered this idea that diabetes happened to you because of your poor choices. But what we know to be true, and I know you all know this intuitively, that there are many compelling factors in your surrounding context that gives rise to the kind of choices that you're able to make. And certainly, Cynthia talked about the adverse childhood experiences, especially those from our population of people that have come through the Indian residential school experiences. All of those have had a profound impact, and they're potent stressors in our everyday life. We live with that every day. So those are still immediate. Those aren't in the past. Those happen to continue even as of now. In the literature, it was also described about extractive industries and how those have marred the landscape in our environment and even the populations of food and plant life that we would rely on for healthy diet. So in the literature, that was described as well. On the plus side, though, there's many different scholars who have talked about cultural continuity as a protective factor. So really reinvigorating and going back to our original teachings and lifestyle practices is one of the keys, obviously, to surmount that, that dismal history and the stressors that are happening there. Mosby, as you know, in 2017, Ian Mosby highlighted some research on what had happened in the residential schools that to this day, I feel impacts on how many of us feel about food, our emotional relationship with food, because of those nutrition experiences, because of the scarcity of good food, because of the lack of healthy fruits and vegetables. All of those things profoundly have impacted our relationship with food. And even Cynthia talked about, how we have these freezers now and we don't do as much sharing as we used to, but also about the struggle food, how we've had to replace, our good wild game and our good plants and medicines with, mainstream foods and the 5 weight gift, as they're called, and how that struggle food has led us into poor nutritive states. So there have been many disruptions to our culture, and even the current experience of people when they go into healthcare settings has led to increased type 2 diabetes. And that's not just here in Canada, but globally amongst populations. And one thing we know is that, those poor experiences that people feel in care settings is really having an impact on their access to healthcare and whether they're, going to continue and really, do those health-seeking behaviors and do the modifications they need to do and have a good relationship with the care provider. And there's also a power dynamic in that encounter with your care provider that has an impact on how well you feel and how well you cope. And so Lindsay Crochue had developed this framework called Educating for Equity, which really challenges physicians and care providers to look at that relationship and to understand that Indigenous people who are coming forward for care have this additional context and baggage and real needs that need to be addressed beyond just the physical care needs that they're being presented with. So I just wanted to share that as a sort of a starting point for some of the death review. Beyond those social determinants of health, we really need to look at the root causes, as Cynthia had mentioned, about Indigenous determinants of health and how those very real traumas have translated into ongoing poor mental health. And when that happens, people fall into a pattern of low self-esteem and self-neglect, and therefore are at increased risk of unhealthy lifestyle. And that's been described in the literature. So we know that there's a very clear association between poor mental health, depression, poor diet, low levels of physical activity, and so on. And this has been exacerbated because of the loss of connection to our land and to our traditional lifestyle. And the fact that our diet has been replaced from what we used to rely on, which kept us healthy for millennia, to what we have now in terms of the processed high sugar content, sugar sweetened beverage foods that Cynthia also talked about. And so we know there's a two-way link between mental health and diabetes. And it's been described in the literature, and it shows us that there is increased risk for diabetes. So it's something that we can't diminish. And I think too often the medical model has really kind of focused and tried to make us only pay attention to the physical component, whereas we know that a person's well-being is dependent on holistic balance in all of those areas. So understanding that there is a link between mental wellness and diabetes, and knowing that the systems and the way that they measure outcomes really just focuses on improvements in mental health, we need to actively push back against that and recognize that the post-traumatic stress response emerging from intergenerational trauma not only leads to consequences in mental health, but also in our physical health. And so having an awareness when you're caring for people about the impacts of colonization and understanding a holistic wellness approach is really important and will empower our people and give them proper care that's needed. So some of the promising practices that have been described in the literature really about recognizing our intimate and ongoing connection to land, and not only on the physical side of it, any one of us who walks out in the forest and feels that fresh air and feels Mother Earth between our under our feet, you know that there's an immediate response, but it goes deeper than that. There's an actual spiritual connection to being able to be out on your own land and territory. And I think the challenge is to recognize and find ways to do this in urban settings where that is so very needed. And recognizing too that the land gives life, just as the elder spoke about at the start of the day. He talked about, giving thanks for all that the land provided to us in food and medicines and plants, and recognizing the land as having that, being the conduit to allow us to connect to our higher power, our creator. The other promising practice is really recognizing and embedding culture in any of the interventions and approaches. And so I'm going to have a slide a little bit later that talks about the integration of mainstream approaches with our own approaches, our own cultural teachings and so on. But one thing I wanted to highlight was that it really is an opportunity. It's an avenue to address and to reach those members of our communities that are harder to engage. One thing we recognize that through the offering of cultural approaches and land-based approaches, it seems more innocuous, like that someone who heretofore might hesitate to join up to activities might actually come out, and while they're there, that's an opportunity to then bring about awareness of many of the key messages that you wish to in diabetes care. So in particular for men, this is a really great approach to use for reaching them, a hard to reach and underserved population. So I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous knowledge in Western science. And many of you will know about, and it's fine, over the years, I think people were in mainstream institutions very skeptical of the value and the intrinsic goodness of our own medicines and ceremonies and healing approaches. But now, thankfully, it's being more and more valued and acknowledged and brought into care settings. So thankfully, that's happening. And at the same time, Marshall and their understanding, they brought about this awareness of two-eyed seeing, where you can look at things with a lens that appreciates and values Western forms of knowledge, but also at the same time equally acknowledges and upholds and privileges our own ways of knowing, which is our traditional and cultural teachings and ceremonies and medicines. And one really cool example that was described in literature talked about perceptions of obesity. So the mainstream lens, I guess, on obesity has always been very negative, and yet, we know from some of our communities that this understanding of whether you're over by 33% or 20% or whatever the best weight is, that you can still be healthy, you can still be physically active. So there's this understanding and this notion that when you're looking at it with an Indigenous lens, that a person can be obese, but still be whole and well and physically active. So two-eyed seeing allows us that space, that ethical space to look at things differently than with only one lens and one eye and one perception of obesity. So it was a really interesting and cool example in the literature. And then there were many examples described about them, and many of you will know about the Ganawati Schools project, which sought to bring in Haudenosaunee teachings into the schoolroom to help promote wellness amongst school-aged children. And where it's leading, I feel, is over time, probably you'll see a lot more described about what we're coming to understand as decolonized diabetes care, in shedding those older notions that only upheld and acknowledged Western approaches to diabetes care, and reinvigorating our own approaches, cultural strength-based approaches to diabetes care. So I'm really excited about that and happy to share that with you too. And where that takes us is in health promotion and prevention. So some of the wise practices that had been described in the literature around this and in building out, and many of you do this already, so that this won't be news to you, but that those health promotion and prevention activities and messages have to be culturally appropriate and geared to the community. And they should really be set in the context of your local community and building on the strengths your own cultural teachings. So that could look very different whether you're in Moose Factory or in Six Nations or elsewhere across the province. But you have your own cultural strength, your own traditional food, your own practices and holistic healing approaches. So it's really diving into that and seeking out your knowledge holders and then centering that Indigenous knowledge within the programming that you do. And incorporating strengths of family and community. A holistic lens also invites one to consider that it's not only about the individual that's combating or dealing with a health concern, but that person nested in their family and within their community as well. And storytelling and other approaches are really one of the seminal ways I think that we in the past would share important learning with our youth and our people. It wasn't so much that we banged them over the head with, didactic messaging, but that by way of sharing stories, people would draw out the essence and the meaning and what was important. And so that should be something that is incorporated. And certainly one of the areas that I really like, and I was happy to see described in the literature, was community asset mapping and really looking internal to what you have for strengths in your community, whether that be, social activities that have sustained community connection and cohesion in the past, and that lends to emotional and social well-being. To land, maybe you have some really fantastic trails or, really cool canoeing routes or what have you. So there's many different ways to look at your community and the assets you have. And the assets don't only reside in the health center. They could be social programs in the community. One of the cool things that my community is doing next week at Pasewam, where we're going to celebrate and remember those that passed on and the ancestors of our territory here. And that is really, to me anyway, it binds us as a community, but it also links us to the strong lineage of our ancestry. So then leads us well to the food security discussion. And I wanted to center it in this notion of food sovereignty, where, typically when we talk about nutrition and food and diet, we're talking about, maybe they're not getting enough fruits and vegetables, or maybe there's not enough green grapes on the shelves, or maybe there's not enough kale, and those kind of things. That's not what I think is the solution. We know that in the past, our traditional diets had high nutritional value, and that there were ways of harvesting, and processing, and preserving. And all of those were keeping us well and healthy. And even the very act of doing that, of the fishing, going out on the land and hunting and gathering and all of those things gave us a holistic wellness by the physical activity, by being connected to our land, by accessing the food that sustained us through millennia. And we've had that disrupted. And even to the point of, and I'm glad Cynthia talked about it, about breastfeeding. In the 40s and 50s, it was really discouraged. People wanted you to buy and put in a baby bottle the formula that was being sold. And so we have to reconnect to those original ways. And lots of things happened to disrupt that, of course. We didn't have access to the land as we did before. People started to lose the knowledge of how to do these things. You needed that knowledge, someone to show you how to make corn soup from the original, ashes and lye and all of that stuff. Like, I don't have that knowledge unless I actively seek it. And it wasn't being taught any longer, and people were not upholding that practice as much. But now, thankfully, there has been, and especially because we know that climate change has degraded our environments, and that's been an impact as well. And I often remember my mom talking about, she used to peel her apples all the time, and I said to her, how can you peel the apples? Like, don't you like the don't you like the apple peel? And she said, well, this thing's probably been sprayed with poison 4 or 5 times, she said, and I'd rather have that. And similarly, she would give us moose meat or deer meat. And I often in my early years thought that store-bought food was better. I was like, how come you don't give us store-bought food? And she said, well, The store bought the cow and the pig, they've been inside of a pen for their whole life. And the deer and the moose have been roaming the land and they're healthy. So why wouldn't I give you healthy food? So in her mind, it was this juxtaposition. And now I recognize the wisdom of that teaching. And so I think what we need to do as a promising practice going forward is to reinstitute those food systems of our own food sovereignty, and take those back, and not be reliant on the high-priced milk that's being flown to the community and so on, and recognize, that we have our own good food out there. Now, I want to just spend a couple of minutes on this slide talking about traditional medicine. And, again, prefacing it in that understanding that there have been so many disruptions and losses. And there's a cultural and historical context to why we face the alarming rates of diabetes that we have in our community. That context to this day is still affecting how we think and what we do and what we decide. But thankfully, we do have people that have that knowledge of ceremony, counseling. They teach us about fasting. And when you fast, you have that much more appreciation for the food that you're given. There's storytelling and sharing and plant-based medicines to help us. And Joseph Pidawanquit from our area does a lovely series of workshops about all of this and about nature and what you have locally that can help you to be well. And so what we know about our teachings is it's more than just, the substance. It's not just the plant. It's not just the food. It's about the whole going out to get it. It's about the giving of thanks, the placing of tobacco as you harvest and gather things to keep you well. And so that traditional medicine operates through many various pathways, and it can be used in combination with medical care. So again, back to that two-eyed seeing approach, not to say, put one to the side, it's no good for us. It is good for us. But at the other hand, they can both equally contribute to your wellness. And what we do know about traditional medicine is, again, that it taps into those spiritual, that wellspring of spiritual and cultural wellness that we need, and links us back to that avenue for healing that somewhere along the line we seem to have lost. And so we know that, when the assault on our well-being was against, the colonization and all of that was an assault on our culture and our identity and our well-being that way, then the response should also be a cultural one, that we take up that culture again and we start to integrate that into the approach to diabetes care and wellness in our community.
Mariette, it's 11:40, so we're at time right now.
Yep.
I'm going to give you maybe another minute or so just to wrap this up, just so we can keep on schedule. We're flying by. I know this is happening so fast.
This is the last slide then, and it is about plant-based physical activity. And I know that because the people from all over that joined into this conference, just the challenge is to think about ways that you get out there onto your land. And it doesn't have to be sweating heavily and really, exerting yourself. It can be a simple practice of walking through the trees. And so I'm just going to leave that as the final message. I'm out of time, but I appreciate everyone listening and joining in for this part of the presentation. And I'll ask if there are questions later. I'm happy.